Awesome. Good afternoon. Welcome to our weekly class, Ethics of the Fathers. We're in the middle of the sixth Mishnah of the sixth chapter. The chapter entitled Kinyan Torah, the acquisition of Torah. How do we acquire Torah? And it goes on to say there are 48 techniques, or 48 steps, 48 different prerequisites that are needed in order for a person to really acquire the Torah, internalize the Torah, so that the Torah is not just a subject that you study and you go to the next subject and you just accumulate different knowledge. Someone once said the difference between East and West is that in the West we just are looking for acquisitions. We want to acquire things. We acquire stuff, and we acquire different knowledge. People have a desire to go touring the world because they want to acquire another experience. That's the nature of the West. We don't take anything seriously unless you need it for your livelihood. Then you take your subject seriously. I'm generalizing, of course, but otherwise, your acquisition of knowledge is not intended for you to become one with your knowledge. That the knowledge should define you and make you a better person and transform you into something higher. But Torah is different. Torah is not just one of the experiences that we have among other experiences. Torah is our very source of life. We say that in our prayers, Ki heim chayenu v'orech yameinu, for they are our lives and the length of our days. And in order for that approach to Torah to manifest itself, one requires these 48 different steps. And we went through some of them last week, so we're not going to repeat them again, just go through them quickly by study, attentive listening, proper speech, by an understanding heart. Okay, the next one is not in most versions of the Mishnah. It's from a different version, so I'm not using that version. By an intelligent heart. We're not going to go into what's the difference between an understanding heart and an intelligent heart, because it seems repetitive, and in many versions, including the version that I use, it doesn't have that. So we're up to the next few steps: by awe, by fear, by humility, by joy, by attending to the sages, by critical give and take with friends, by fine argumentation with disciples, by clear thinking. We'll just stop over there. We'll try to go through all of these for today. What does he mean by awe and by fear? When you're dealing with Torah in particular, considering the fact that Torah is divine wisdom, you can't approach it and try to internalize it with no sense of awe and reverence for God in particular, and also the repetitive expression by awe and by fear. The word fear is an incorrect, or I really shouldn't say incorrect translation, but a limited translation, because the word yira in Hebrew has many, many different levels of translation, from fear to awe to reverence to shame to total surrendering of one's ego. These are all different translations of the word yira. I always conjectured, I don't know if it has any validity, that the English word aware is related to the word yira, because these emotions of fear, of awe and reverence come about when you have an awareness, an acute awareness of something. If you don't have an awareness that there's a threat, God forbid a person is in a house and there's carbon monoxide leaking, you're not aware of it, so you're not going to show any fear or any respect for that threat. When you become aware of it, you run out of the house. It motivates you. So we have to have an awareness of God to motivate this feeling of awe. But there's two kinds of awe. There's awe for God, and there's awe for the teachers of Torah. What does that mean? The Talmud tells a story. There was a certain rabbi whose name was Shimon ben Manasseh, and he had a thesis that he devoted his whole life to, that wherever the Torah uses the word et, which doesn't really come out in translation, like it says Bereshit in the beginning, bara Elokim, God created, et hashamayim, the heavens, the et haaretz, and the earth. Now if I took out the words et, it would have the same translation. So what does the word et mean? So he came up with this theory, a very plausible one, that whenever the Torah uses the word et, it means the thing that is mentioned here and all its subsidiaries. So when it says in the beginning God created heaven, it means heaven and all that which is in the heavens, the stars, and everything that's in the heaven, the black holes and everything. When it says and the earth, it means not just the earth, it means the earth and everything with the earth. And he went through every time the Torah uses the word et, I don't know how many times, hundreds of times, and he had a beautiful interpretation for each one. That when the Torah says something, let's say in the Ten Commandments, it says, Kabed et avicha, honor your father. Now the word et is unnecessary. If we would just say Kabed avicha, it would mean the same thing, honor your father. So his interpretation, which was accepted by all the rabbis, was that the word et means not just your father, but the one who is subsidiary or subordinate to your father, namely your older brother, that you're obligated to show respect to your older brother. So he went through the whole Torah until he came to a verse in the book of Deuteronomy. He went through like 4/5 plus of the Torah, and there it says, you shall fear God or have reverence for God. And it uses the word et. And he says, 1 second, how can I interpret this? Is there anything else equal to God? That's blasphemous to say that there's something equal to God that we have to fear or have reverence for other than God. So you know what he did? He said, my whole thesis is wrong. Imagine a professor of physics who comes up with a theory and his whole life he's publishing papers and books and everyone is celebrating this brilliant physicist. He wins the Nobel Prize for physics. Maybe he wins 2 prizes. And then when he's 75 years old and he's retired, he realizes he comes across a proof that his whole thesis was wrong and his whole life's career goes down the drain. How many people are capable of doing that? Well, this Rabbi Shimon did it, and he said, just like God will reward me for my exposition, for my interpretations, he'll reward me for abandoning them, because I'm interested in truth. Until Rabbi Akiva came along, who was the greatest scholar of his time, greater than this Shimon ben Manasseh. And he says, no, you don't have to abandon it. There is something equal to God in terms of showing reverence. The Torah scholar, the person who has allowed the Torah to define him, that person deserves reverence just like God deserves reverence. Now, of course, we're not talking on the same scale, but because this person is not just a smart person. If it's just someone smart, someone who, a Nobel laureate in physics or medicine, it's laudable. It's something you can praise a person for that, but you can't show reverence to that person and put it in the same category as having reverence for God. But the Torah scholar who's defined by the Torah, so not just someone who studies Torah. You could be a great scholar, but it doesn't make you in what the Talmud refers to as a Talmud Chacham. It's someone who has internalized the Torah, so the Torah has become inseparable from him. That's the person for whom you have to have reverence. Why? Because it's not reverence for him, it's reverence for God. Because this person has God's Torah, which is divine wisdom in him, and has made it a part of his very being. Another interpretation about what's the fear over here. Okay, the reverence for God, but there is fear. The fear is misinterpreting something. There were many stories of rabbis who would come into the house of study and they would recite a prayer, God, protect me from making mistakes and erring in my interpretations of the Torah, especially when it was about practical matters. Someone asked the rabbi a question about how to observe the Shabbos, what's kosher, what's not, what medical treatments are acceptable, what are not. The rabbi has to always have the sense that, you know what, I am human, I can make mistakes, and I pray to God that I shouldn't make mistakes and cause other people to stumble, cause other people to do things that are wrong. This was always in the minds of the great scholars. They would always feel vulnerable. In fact, there's a statement in the Talmud that a Torah scholar, a judge who's synonymous with a Torah scholar, should always imagine that there's a sharp sword suspended over his neck. And if he makes a mistake, boom, the sword comes down on him. Always feel that trepidation, and that trepidation makes you go straight. Because if you know that your mistake is going to cost you your life, you're going to make sure you're not going to make that mistake. So that's the fear that you have to have. If you want to acquire Torah, you always have to have a fear that you might misinterpret things, and your teachings will be misguided. The next one is with humility. In order to be receptive to something, you have to be an empty vessel. Just like if you have a cup and it's full and you add more liquid to it, you're not going to get anything out of that. It's just going to spill over. If you're full of yourself and you think, I'm the great scholar, I'm the brilliant person, and I'm learning something new, I don't have to really do anything in order for me to absorb it, because the person says he's brilliant, he has an open mind, a very brilliant way of understanding things. That person's arrogance will be a great obstacle for him to really absorb the teachings of the Torah, because you have to be an empty vessel. And this is an echo of what it says earlier in Ethics of the Fathers. Who is truly a wise person? Someone who learns from everyone. If you are arrogant and you think you're the brilliant scholar and you can't learn from someone who knows less than you, if that's how you feel, then you are not considered a scholar. And then not only you're not considered a scholar, that'll be an impediment for you to really learn, because everything that you learn is colored by your preconceived notions. You're not able to learn anything new, because whatever you learn, you're going to take it in a way that supports your own thesis, your own ideas, your own approaches. In order for you to really be receptive to the Torah, you have to have humility. Now, there are two types of humility. There's humility that comes from reverence. When you have reverence for God, that makes you humble, because you realize how awesome God is. And when we say the word awesome, nowadays awesome is anything but awesome. But in the olden days, awesome meant something. When we said God is awesome, today if teenagers will use the word for anything. But when God is truly awesome, when you're in the presence of something so big, so great, so overwhelmingly powerful, it reduces you. You become humble. So then, isn't it redundant? If you already have this this sense of awe, this reverence for God, you are automatically humble. But there are two kinds of humility, and there's a story that illustrates it. A rabbi was once in a synagogue, and one of the members was trying to show how insignificant he is and really showed that he was very humble. But someone else got in his way, and he started shouting at the person, "Who do you think you are? You're a nobody." So someone said, "1 second, a few minutes ago you were telling God how you're a nothing, that God is so great and you're a nothing. And now you're acting so arrogant to that other person, so condescending." He says, "Yeah, I'm a nothing in the presence of God, but he's a bigger nothing." In other words, you could be humble when you think about God, but you could be extremely arrogant in relation to other people and think that, they tell a similar joke. They tell of this rabbi who gets up on Yom Kippur and he proclaims before God, "God, I'm a nobody, I'm a nothing, I'm worthless, I'm like dust of the earth." And the president of the shul gets up and he says the same thing, I'm a nothing, I'm a nobody. And then one of the members of the shul gets up and says, and the rabbi turns to the president, who does he think he is that he can be such a nothing? So sometimes your nothingness can be very arrogant. You're showing off your nothingness by using God as your source of what makes you nothing, and therefore you can look down at others because they're not as humble as you are. You're more humble than the other person. So there's a humility that comes from being in awe of God, but then there's humility in relation to others. That you're not going to look down at someone just because they don't have as much knowledge as you, because they could teach you something that you could never get on your own. The next thing is with joy. What do we mean by joy? Some people might think that when you study Torah, because it's a religious exercise, you're not supposed to enjoy it. You're supposed to do it because it's the right thing. God commanded us to do it. You're a soldier. God commands you to do certain things you don't really enjoy. We still do it. The commandments were not given to us for our pleasure and enjoyment. But Torah study is an exception to that rule. It doesn't mean you can't enjoy doing mitzvahs, but that's not the purpose of the mitzvah. The purpose of the mitzvah is to do what God tells us to do, and if you enjoy doing it, that's an added bonus. But when it comes to Torah study, if you really want Torah study to be effective and you want to acquire it, you have to be in a state of joy. You have to enjoy it. It's something that is the most enjoyable thing. I think I mentioned this the other day, that for people who are more sophisticated, aesthetic pleasure is much more enjoyable than physical and sensual pleasure. For someone who is a scholar of Torah, who really gets into Torah, there's nothing more enjoyable, nothing more exciting, nothing more exhilarating than studying Torah. When you see people studying Talmud, for example, and they get into it, it's as if there's nothing else in the world that matters to them. There was a rabbi in the city of Tarnopol about 150 years ago. This I heard from someone who heard it from a person who knew him, that he was ill for a few weeks and he was laid up in bed in the hospital and he couldn't learn. Finally, when he was able to open up a volume of the Talmud, he just buried his head in it, and it looked like a person who hadn't had water to drink for a week, and he comes to an oasis and there's a pond there and he puts his head in the water and can't get enough of it. That's the description of this person's study, that he missed it so much that he couldn't get enough. I told this story many times of Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev, the famous Hasidic master who passed away in about 1810, I think. And in his old age, he was very weak and sick, and he wasn't in good shape physically. Yom Kippur, he fasted. He probably could have found an excuse not to fast, but he fasted the 25 hours of Yom Kippur. And as soon as the fast was over, and the family was very concerned about his health, he said, "I'm thirsty. I'm so thirsty." So they rushed to the kitchen, they got him a glass of water, and they put it down in front of him. He had opened up a volume of the Talmud called Sukkah that deals with the laws of the holiday of Sukkot. And he ignored the cup of water, and he started studying Talmud. A half hour, an hour later, he said, "Oh, I'm so thirsty." And they rushed to the kitchen, they brought him a glass of water. The original glass was still there, it was full. And this went on all night long. The man was a man in his 70s. He was very weak and sickly, and he hadn't eaten for 25 hours, and he hadn't had anything to drink. And now he's saying he's thirsty, and he's ignoring the water. And this went on until the morning, till daybreak, when he concluded the volume of the Talmud, which is about a little over 110 pages. And to study even one page of Talmud takes most people an hour, 2, 3 hours. And he did the whole thing in one evening, one night. And then in the morning, they said to him, "You said you were thirsty and you didn't even touch the water." And he says, "Thirsty for water? I was thirsty for Torah. The entire Yom Kippur I was praying. I didn't have a chance to study Torah. I couldn't just bear it, not having studied Torah for so many hours. I just couldn't get enough of it." It didn't even occur to him that he hadn't had any water to drink and he was thirsty. He was oblivious to his own physical needs, because the pleasure, it wasn't because it was a religious exercise as much as it was an enjoyable exercise. Yes, because it was a religious exercise, you could say. So if you really want to acquire Torah, you have to really enjoy it. You can't just do it as a religious exercise because I have no choice, I have to do it. Obviously, if you don't enjoy studying Torah and you do it because God said so, that has value as well. But if you want to acquire the Torah, it has to be something that really causes you tremendous joy. Another reason why you have to be happy to study Torah, because you realize how privileged you are that you have the ability to study God's Torah. The privilege is incredible. And when you study Torah with joy, it helps you understand the Torah, and it helps you remember it. Why does joy help you with understanding it? Memory is easier to understand, because memory, if something is significant, you'll remember it. You don't remember things that are insignificant. But things that are significant in your life, you don't forget. You don't forget your anniversary, because your anniversary is the same as your wife's anniversary. That was a joke. So things that are important, you don't forget. If you study Torah reluctantly or just going through the motion because you have to do it, it's not going to stay in your memory. If you want it to stay in your memory, it has to be memorable. And if you study Torah with joy, it becomes memorable. But how does it help in understanding? So here you have to go into a deeper understanding of what joy is. Joy is not just a simple emotion. Joy means that your soul is open. Joy means that there are no blockages. When a person is depressed, what does that mean? It means that there's so much that blocks the person, and it blocks their emotion, occludes their emotions. It doesn't allow their emotions to be expressed. So when a person is in a state of joy, their mind opens as well. Your mind could be, when you're in a bad mood, when something negative happened in your life, and you try to study something, you can't concentrate because there are blockages there. When you're in a state of joy, the blockages disappear. We're told that a prophet, the real prophets, could not say their prophecy, would not receive the prophetic visions if they were not in a state of joy. And that's why they played music before the prophets, to get them to generate a state of joy. So that's another example of how things that are spiritual can't enter into you unless you are in a state of joy. This story is told about the prophet Elisha, that he was not in a state of joy, and when he turned into a state of joy, that's when he became a prophet. That's when he was able to receive the prophetic messages. The only question is, if you have yira is awe and reverence, how could you have both at the same time? How could you be in a state of awe, trepidation. You're in the presence of something overwhelming, and it just humbles you. And how could you be happy at the same time? So, two answers to that question. Number one, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the same two emotions at the same time. The Talmud tells us that there was a certain rabbi whose name was Rabbi, that before he would start his class, he would crack a joke. And that opened up the students' minds. And afterwards, they would sit with great awe and trepidation. So the joy was the opening experience in order for them to have their minds open, and that was followed by the awe. But it's not necessarily true that you can't do the two at the same time. The Zohar says that a person could be sad on one hand because they know they did sins, they did something wrong, and they could be joyous on the other hand that they have the opportunity to serve God. It's just in one side of your heart you have sadness, and the other side of your heart you have joy. We have the power to alternate from one emotion to another if they're emotions that are rooted in goodness and holiness. The next thing is there are two versions. My version, it has with purity. When your mind and heart are pure, then you are more receptive to the words of Torah. Because if a person's mind is not pure and holy, person's mind is focused on other things that are not holy, on materialistic things, that is an impediment to study. But then he goes on, there are three things that are necessary for absorbing the words of Torah. You have to have attending the sages, a critical give and take with friends, colleagues, by fine argumentation with disciples. Those are three things that refer to teachers, your relationship with your teachers, your colleagues, and your students. The Talmud says that one of the rabbis stated, it's a very famous quote, "I learned much from my teachers. I learned more from my colleagues, but the most I got from my students." And this is really what's indicated over here. The first thing, you have to have good teachers. But it doesn't say learning from good teachers. It says to serve the teachers, attending to the sages. What does that mean, attending to them? You're not just there to a formal class. The teacher gives a class, and you come to the class and you take notes, and you're very good at absorbing everything. No, you have to be someone who attends the teacher, who lives with the teacher, who sees how the teacher behaves, who sees how the teacher behaves when he's not in a formal setting. The Torah, when it talks about the prophet Elisha was a disciple of Elijah. Sometimes people confuse the two. There's Elijah, Eliyahu, and there's Elisha, who was a disciple of Elijah. And when it describes Elisha's relationship with Elijah, it says, Yatzak Mayim, he would pour water when he was in the presence of Eliyahu. He served him, he is an attendant. And the Talmud makes an observation. It doesn't say he studied Torah from him. It was his teacher. He obviously studied under Eliyahu, under Elijah. But that's not what made him great and a fitting successor to Elijah. What was made him great was that he poured water, that he stayed in his house, and he attended to him. Same thing with Joshua and Moses. Who succeeded Moses? Joshua. Joshua was not necessarily the greatest scholar and who studied the most Torah. But he says in the Torah, Misharet Moshe, he was the servant of Moses. He served him. He lived in his tent. He attended to his needs. And that way he picked up more than just book knowledge. He picked up what's beyond the books, between the lines, and so on. So that's the first thing. The first thing you have to serve your teachers in a way that goes beyond just having formal lessons that you hear from your teacher. You have to live with the teacher. The second thing is your relationship with your colleagues. It's not enough to have a teacher. You have to have a colleague a friend with whom you study in order for you to absorb the Torah. Now, you could learn on your own, but if you learn on your own, the Talmud says you'll become foolish, because all of your ingrained mistakes will remain that way. How are you going to get rid of your mistakes, your misinterpretations, when you're studying together with a colleague who, when he hears you say something foolish, he says, how could you say a thing like that? It's wrong. And ultimately, it'll put you on the right path, and the straightforward path. Now, the Rebbe once said that having a study partner, by the way, in a yeshiva, in an academy, and even in high school level, every student is paired up with another student. So you'll see if the schedule is, let's say, 8 hours a day of learning, actually it's more than 8 hours. When we were in a high school level, our first class was 7:30 a.m. and the last class ended 9:30 p.m. And then people would still stay beyond that and study even more. In the middle, you had a break for prayers and for breakfast, lunch, and supper, and a little bit of recess for sports. So you're talking about sometimes 10, 12 hours a day. Most of those 10, 12 hours, you would be paired up with a colleague to study together. And you would constantly be arguing with your colleague. And that arguing was not just a way of showing off your knowledge. It wasn't just a way of making the learning more exciting, but it was a way to really learn properly, because inevitably you're going to make mistakes. And by the way, you see that picture? That man who's talking to the Rebbe, that man told me, and I tested him, that he knew the whole Talmud by heart with major commentaries word for word. So he happens to be on that screen right now. Rabbi Hirschsprung. At any rate, he was someone who probably had a study partner when he studied in yeshiva, and he had good teachers. Although he told me a story, and this relates to what we were learning about the awe and the reverence. His teacher, who was a brilliant scholar, and tragically he was murdered by the Germans in the Holocaust. So his teacher asked him a question, and he answered, and then he asked his teacher a question. He posed a question to his teacher, and his teacher couldn't answer it. He stumped his teacher. And he told me, I couldn't sleep all night because of that. And the next morning I had to go to the teacher to beg for forgiveness. That's someone who had reverence for his teacher. You know, he didn't mean to embarrass his teacher, because his teacher was a greater scholar than he was. Maybe he didn't have the same photographic memory, but he was a phenomenal scholar, but he stumped him. It's not so hard to do, to stump someone even who's brilliant. I shouldn't say it's not so hard. It is hard, but it's not impossible. But he had this reverence, and he would ask him for forgiveness. So your colleague is there to set you straight. And the Rebbe once told someone that having a partner is good on two counts. From the perspective of your animal soul, your selfish personality, and on the level of your godly soul, your selfless personality. On the level of your animal soul, your partner says something, and your animal soul doesn't like the fact that your partner came up with such a good idea. So what does your selfish animal soul do? You try to refute the person. Well, you can only refute someone if you know the subject very well. So you have to dig in deeper and figure out the deeper meaning of the subject so you can refute your colleague. Now, your godly soul has the opposite. Your godly soul, when your colleague says something wrong, is in pain. How can my colleague do something wrong? And what do? You try to defend your colleague. So in order to defend the colleague, you have to go deeper into the subject. My father, of blessed memory, told me this story, that when he was in yeshiva, his teacher, who was one of the greatest Talmudic scholars in the world, was visited by another one of the greatest scholars in the world, known as Rabbi Wasserman, who perished by the Nazis. but he was visiting America in the 1930s. And he gave a lecture, a Talmudic lecture, and his colleague, the one that was here in New York, his name was Reb Shlomo Hyman, realized that he made a terrible mistake. And he literally became sick. He couldn't come to the yeshiva to give his classes. And my father went to visit his teacher. My father was very attached to his teacher. And they spent hours and hours trying to reconstruct the argument of this Rebbe Chanan Wasserman, because it bothered them so badly that this rabbi's colleague made such a terrible mistake, or at least it seemed that way. And I don't know if they were able to defend him or not, but they certainly mastered the subject in a way they never mastered it before, because they were struggling to figure out a way of possibly defending the thesis of the other scholar. So whether it's your selfish side, you're going to go deeper into the subject, or it's your selfless side, you're going to go deeper into the subject. That's why it's good to have a colleague. But it's not enough to have a colleague. You learn the most from your students, because the students will argue and question you more than anyone else. And that's how you learn the most, from answering questions. I don't got too many questions here, so I can't be that smart, because I don't have too many students asking questions. That's a hint. And the next one is by clear thinking. That's not exactly the literal translation. The Hebrew word is b'yishuv, settled. You have to be settled, which means that if your mind is distracted by other things, could be you're distracted by your work, you're distracted by illness, you're distracted by criticism, whatever it is that distracts you, your mind is not open. You have to get rid of distractions. In order for you to absorb Torah, you have to be able to divorce your mind from all those things that distract. And there are people, not everyone could do that. So there's certain people who can have all the worries in the world, and then when they sit down to study Torah, they're completely oblivious to everything. The Rebbe once told a story about his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe. His father-in-law was about to go on a trip. The trip was extremely serious matters, probably life and death matters, very, very distracting. And he sees his father-in-law studying something that required tremendous amount of concentration, as if nothing was happening, as if he had no worries in the world. So the Rebbe tells us in his story, he says to his father-in-law, "How do you do this?" Now, I can assure you the Rebbe could have done it himself as well, but the Rebbe always looked at someone else's brilliance and ability to do things. So his father-in-law said, it's called success in time. And he said there was a rabbi who lived 800 years ago, known as the Rashba. He was the greatest Talmudic scholar of his time, who lived in Spain. He not only was a great scholar, but every day he gave scholarly lessons to his students. He was also a physician. That's what he did to earn a living. He would also write thousands of letters. We have about 4,000 of his letters that he wrote to people to answer questions of matters of Jewish law from all over the world. This is 800 years ago, and we only probably have a fraction of what he wrote. He wrote many books. He took a walk every day. He would take a walk, and he slept 8 hours a night. How does a human being have the ability to do all that? So the previous Rebbe said it's because he had success in time. When he was involved in something, he was totally involved. Nothing was able to intrude. So he had no distractions whatsoever. No matter what was going on, it did not distract him. He was able to put himself totally into the subject. When you can do that, you can accomplish much more. The reason why we can't accomplish as much is because while we're doing A, we're thinking about B. While we're doing B, we're thinking about C. And so in order for you to really absorb Torah, you have to have the ability to be settled and not be distracted by other things, no matter how important they are. And that's a gift that certain people have more than others, and others have to struggle, have to work hard at acquiring that gift in order for them to acquire Torah. Any questions? Yes. Save the day, Max, by a question. What?
What is it mistake and what is it interpretation?
What's a mistake?
I tell you, you have a lot of scholars, a lot of great interpreter of Torah, and they have different interpretation.
And
everybody right, and maybe everybody wrong, because will come new generation, and they say not. Do you know they were right, but we are right much more.
People can make mistakes. People, even the greatest people, can make mistakes. Now,
but no, in this,
when you're studying,
about Torah, I can be mistaken. No composer wrote this. I play.
Yeah, you can play the music the wrong way. You can play the wrong notes. You can make mistakes.
Composer right, I play correct notes, all notes correct. But somebody playing this way.
Okay, there's room for different interpretations, and they're both right. But I'm talking about someone who makes a real mistake, who mistranslates something. People can make mistakes. And how are you going to know you made a mistake? The answer is, if you don't have colleagues, and if you don't have students, you may never discover that you made a mistake. You can sometimes discover it on your own, but not always. That's why it's important that you have someone with whom to compare notes. But students are even better than colleagues because they challenge you more. They question you more. Sometimes students question because they want to show off their knowledge to their teacher, but meanwhile the teacher has to respond. I once had an experience. One of my teachers, I'm not going to mention a name because it's not a compliment for him. It's a partial compliment. He was brilliant. A man who virtually knew the Talmud by heart. He was actually a colleague of the one I mentioned before. And he was intimidating. I would be afraid to ask him a question because he was very, very sharp. And I just became his student. So I sat behind where he was at a lectern, and I was a little bit behind him. And one time he said something, I was convinced 100% that he was wrong. It's hard to be 100% convinced 100%, but this was 100%. So I mustered the courage, and I asked him, how could you say this when the Talmud says this? And he turns around and gives me a dirty look. And he turns around to the students, says, did you hear his question? And I could see the wheels were spinning in his mind to think of a way out of it. Because I think he realized that I got him. So he said to the other students, did you hear what he asked? He didn't wait for them to answer if they heard it or not. He says, he asked me this, this, and this. And he came up with a brilliant answer on the spot. It was brilliant, but it wasn't right. That's why I'm not mentioning his name. The fact that I asked him that question forced him to go into the subject in a level that he hadn't done before to come up with a brilliant answer. Whether it was right or wrong is a separate issue, but that's what questions can do. Questions could just, wow, and if your teacher is not like that teacher, but is honest, it's very hard to be honest to your students, to show that you were wrong. I think I told this once before. A student of my father told me that my father would generally give his lecture to the students, and my father's lectures were very, very deep and very intricate, and most of the students could not master it, couldn't understand it. but there were a few students who were brilliant, and my father would share his thesis to them before the class. And one of the students told me that he argued with my father and said my father's approach was not the right approach, and he came up with a different approach. And my father got up there and gave the lecture and said, my approach was wrong, this is the right approach, and repeated what the student had said, and made the whole lecture based on the student. Now, and this student told me he had never had a teacher that would do a thing like that. That was my father's uniqueness. Also, it showed that he didn't need to always be right. He had enough self-confidence that even if he was wrong in some areas, he still was enough of a scholar to not have to try to defend himself when he knew that he was wrong. I don't even know if he was wrong. His approach was not as good as the approach of the student. But when students ask questions, even if they're bad questions, it forces the teacher to think more deeply into the subject to find an answer. The Rabbi, who's on the screen over here, I mentioned this many times, was upset when he said things and people didn't question him. It bothered him that people were not serious enough about learning that they didn't question what he said. And when the next week when they started questioning what he said, he was upset that they didn't try to think of an answer. He didn't like laziness, intellectual laziness. If you're accepting it because I said it, then I haven't succeeded in teaching. A teacher wants to make sure that the student gets it right, and if there's a flaw in the teacher's reasoning, he wants the student to point it out. And sometimes the teacher will admit that he was wrong, and sometimes the teacher will show that he wasn't wrong. But either way, the teacher will have to work harder to present his defense.
Many times there's different interpretations.
Yes, there can be valid interpretations. And
so it's not necessarily right or wrong.
No, not necessarily, but sometimes that itself could be the benefit, that sometimes you come up with different interpretations. You have a broader view of the subject, and sometimes you may be wrong. And to admit that you're wrong is itself it's a higher level of learning, because then it shows your learning is not selfish learning. It's not just for your own greatness, but it's because you're looking for the truth. And when you search for the truth, you will have a better understanding of the subject. Ultimately, you'll find the truth.